Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I am your host, Andrew Langer. And as you've heard me say before, one of my favorite parts of hosting the show is when I get to sit down with old friends, long-term friends, because as you can see from our guest, she's certainly not old. Her name is Jessica Melugin. She is the director of the Center for Technology and Innovation at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And in the interest of full disclosure, I am a CEI alumnus from way back then. You know, it's been more than 20 years, Jessica. But Jessica and I worked together, and then she left. I left CEI, and she left CEI, but she's back there. I got all kinds of stories to tell. Jessica, in fact, talk a little bit about CEI. Tell us a little bit about what CEI does.
So CEI is a free market think tank here in Washington, D.C., and we focus on regulatory issues, pushing back on the regulatory state. And we don't really get into much of the social issues. Thankfully, we get to hide out in sort of the nuts and bolts of the hard numbers and what it's costing American taxpayers to float this giant sea of regulations across every industry in America.
It's a situation in which, as you and I both know, that regulations impact every aspect of life. As I'm fond of saying, it's where the rubber hits the road. Congress passes a law, but it's those regulations, it's the rules that the agencies put out that hit folks squarely between the eyes. How did you get interested in tech policy? And it's not just tech policy you're interested in, we'll get into that, but how did you get interested in tech policy? How did you start doing the work that you're doing?
I think I was afflicted by these concerns as a young child. I grew up with my parents having a small business. They owned a manufacturing business in Southern California. And it was sort of just day to day that I became kind of a fan of entrepreneurs and business owners. And I saw all the regulatory harm that can be done, even if it's well-intentioned, you know, what raising the minimum wage, what was the real effect of that? I know because I saw it happen in my parents' business and lots of employment law, all those sorts of things. And I thought, you know, this is really out of control. This isn't fair. You know, my parents are trying to employ people and give them a good life and support their families. And there was like one of the hardest things for that was dealing with the regulatory stuff. And of course, you know, that was Southern California, so it's an extreme case. But I think, you know, you hear these platitudes about all the good you're going to do, but so many of these regulations just make it harder and harder for people to make a living and provide for their families. And so I think it's always been on my brain. And then when I figured out in college, I went to Claremont McKenna College in Southern California. I figured out, you know, maybe I could make a living fighting this stuff. So CEI was where I interned, and it was really my first job out of college. I worked for the legendary Clyde Wayne Cruz here, who's still here doing great work.
Oh, yes.
And it's always felt like a family.
You know, it's interesting because I just had a conversation recently with Elizabeth Melito, who's the head of the Small Business Legal Center at the National Federation of Independent Business. And we were talking about the bureaucracy and how the bureaucracy sort of proposes regulations in a vacuum without really understanding the impact. And I like to express regulations in terms of the time burden, because as you know from your parents, time is the only resource that a business owner can't make more of. But yet we have a situation in which bureaucrats seem to not understand this. Talk a little bit about the disconnect between what is being done in these bureaucracies and what's happening out in the real world.
Yeah, I think there's just a problem. If you haven't been exposed to that real business world, you've never worked in it or been around it, it doesn't seem real, and you don't have much of an insight into how these business people really need to make decisions about trade-offs and scarce resources. And I think, you know, even with some of this, there's an idea, this kind of nefarious idea that they're trying to, you know, screw over their workers or harm their competitors. And that's not, you know, that's not what we see out there. Yeah. I'll give you one example of sort of the disconnect is there's a lot of talk in Washington right now, worried about mergers and acquisitions in tech and in a lot of industries now. It's kind of rolled over into airlines and healthcare stuff. And it's just sort of a given in Washington, this is bad. Mergers and acquisitions are bad. People get laid off. It makes things more concentrated. It's bad. But if you talk to people, especially like in Silicon Valley, about the ecosystem of a startup, venture capital investments, and then how you go and you sell your business because it gets acquired, and then you take that money and you go back and you start the next great idea. It's a really virtuous cycle of innovation and success. It's the American dream. And they all instinctively understand, the people working in the industry understand that. The bureaucrats in Washington kind of see boogeyman wherever, in the shadows. And it's just, there's such a difference between what's happening in the marketplace and what people are wringing their hands about here in Washington.
You and I both worked under the great, now retired Fred Lee Smith, who was the founder of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And he used to talk about the virtue of capitalism. It was actually one of the mainstays of what CEI does. I'm going to ask you about this and what because that's what I think part of what you're talking about. But I want to ask it in the context of what you were just talking about with Silicon Valley, because for whatever reason, so much bad advocacy on policy is coming out of these places. And listen, I don't mean to get into the controversial stuff about social media platforms. We'll get to that later. But just in terms of the sort of the advocacy for bad policy coming out of these places, in terms of this issue of the virtues of capitalism.
Well, I think that capitalism gets a bad rap here in town. It's certainly not the most popular thing in the Beltway right now.
Sure.
But if you look at, the sort of the hard evidence for capitalism, it's an incredibly prosperous system. It's peaceful. It invites people who might not have anything to do with each other otherwise to trade and exchange and work together. And it's not perfect. It doesn't always come up with the perfect outcome, but it's certainly far and away the best system we've come up with so far about how to lead successful, productive, healthful, wealthy lives. I mean, that's what we want for everyone, I hope. So, Fred was a master at talking about capitalism in a really humanizing way, because that's what it is, right? It's decentralized, and it's a bunch of human beings peacefully exchanging and trading in order to benefit both parties. So I think that's something we lose sight of. We forget, we start sort of beating up on the company because it's big or it makes other decisions we don't agree with politically, which I completely understand. But the basic merits of a free enterprise system should sort of be beyond question at this point. I mean, it really is the best system. I know it's not, but if you look at the empirical evidence, it really is it's lifted more people out of poverty than anything else ever has, not even close.
Well, this gets into a lot of the themes in the very recent, because we've recorded this in advance. We recorded this just after the State of the Union. The themes in the State of the Union. Every time I hear somebody, I'm gonna. By the way, folks, I apologize. I'm going to be name dropping CEI alumni all throughout this conversation. But the point is, every time I hear somebody talk about airline regulation or and the problems of airline deregulation and mergers and acquisitions, all I can think about is our former colleague, now the late James Gattuso, who would constantly, and I would ask questions about airlines and people being charged different amounts for seats. But then when it comes down to it, right? You get the Southwest of the world, and we can all beat up on Southwest. But I love Southwest and the model that they've done. And you buy a ticket X and you get it in advance and you get it super cheap and you get no frills. Listen, I'm someone. This is well before your time, Jessica. But there was an airline called People Express. It was resurrected a couple of years ago and then failed. People Express, you would not pay for your ticket until you were sitting in your seat on the plane. Somebody would run through with one of those old school credit card readers. And
I like that.
Yes.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, but my point is that we've never lived in a world. Actually, this is where I want to go, because this is where CEI has really been head and shoulders, I think, above just about everybody else in the policy world. CEI talks about the human cost of these things. That, we do these things, we want to get rid of resort fees, or we want to get rid of, I know this isn't your area, but we want to get rid of late fees for credit cards, without recognizing that there's a market impact to this, that, it's going to make it harder for people to get bank accounts or harder for people to get credit cards. You guys have done really good on this, whether it's climate or whether or not it's financial services, whether or not it's tech policy, right? We all know that the most expensive internet is going to be when the internet is free. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there just is cost in the world because there is scarcity in the world, and this is the reality of the world. You can't wish it away with good intentions. So just because Southwest lets you do a bare bones ticket doesn't mean there aren't other airlines and other options. But if you get rid of that bare bones option, you're cutting a certain segment of people out of air travel. the poorest people.
Yes.
I don't think that's, what anyone intends, but that certainly is the economic reality. And like you were saying, you can take that example for lots of different industries that these charges, we don't want those charges. Well, things cost money to get done. There's charges, and the way that those things are disseminated through different customers probably means that more overall people are allowed to use that service, right? You can't just wish those things away. Things cost money.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember angering a former head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to the point where he actually addressed me from the podium as I was giving my public comments, because I dared point out, as they're talking about payday lending and the, short-term high-risk lending, let's call it what it really is, the exorbitant, I'm using air quotes here, exorbitant rates for the loan terms. He didn't like the fact that I pointed out that if you take out a 30-year fixed rate mortgage on your house, over the course of those 30 years, you're going to pay twice as much for your house as you took out on the loan. He didn't like that very much. And yet what they want to do is, so their answer, right, they want to get rid of payday lending because they don't like it. They want to turn it over to the post office, putting the taxpayers on the hook for it. I mean, this is generally right. The answer to this is ultimately what Ronald Reagan said and what Wayne has repeated many, many times, Wayne Cruz. If something works, you regulate it. If it survives, you tax it. And if it dies, you subsidize it, right? That's what we're talking about here, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes I think that politicians mistake that we live in a fallen world, right? We have scarcity. Things aren't perfect. The market is not perfect. They mistake that state of affairs, which is basically the human condition, for a political problem that needs their intervention. And that's a self-serving reaction, and it's also part of human nature. But it's important to have groups like CEI kind of give people the other side of the coin on that, which is you might end up doing more harm than good, even with the best of intentions.
Yeah, folks, if you haven't, CEI did a great video a couple of years back about climate, in which they showed somebody trying to ride through the snow on a bicycle, which is really in the end what that side, the statists in the end want. So let's turn our attention specifically to your work, Jessica, because you are doing great work. You're back at CEI now after you were there, then you left, and now you're back. How long have you been back? I'm sorry.
A couple of years. I took some time off when my kids were little. I didn't want to miss that time with them, but now they're in school and they have cooler people to hang out with.
Yes.
So we just stick to mornings and evenings, and seems to be fine.
And in between, you're doing your work on tech policy, among other things. I want to start here not on the tech policy side of it, but what is the eye on the FTC?
So just bringing everyone up to date on what's going on at the Federal Trade Commission. This is sort of America's #1 consumer protection agency, and they should be busying themselves with fighting fraud and protecting consumers. But we've sort of seen in the last couple of years with the Biden administration, Chair Lina Khan is definitely an ideologue extremist, and they're really pushing the boundaries of their power and scope at the FTC. And we thought, this is something that could be a little dry, is a little bit in the weeds, is a little bit inside the beltway, and we wanted to shine some light on it and take what's happening and explain it in a way that it means something to the consumers that are going to be the victims of these bad policies. So they're kind of dropping tried and true, trusted economic evaluations of situations. They're getting away from the consumer welfare standard and antitrust, which basically says if consumers are being hurt, you have an antitrust case. If not, you probably have something else. And we've been under that rule for 40 years. It's a really cleaned up U.S. antitrust law. We have probably the best regime in the world, which is why you see so many global tech company leaders are U.S. companies.
Sure.
Those companies probably couldn't exist anywhere else in the form that they do. Controlled by the Communist Chinese Party is a different matter.
Absolutely.
But in terms of being real private companies, the amount of innovation, success, jobs that they offer, value to people's retirement accounts probably couldn't be emulated anywhere else around the world because we have this permissionless innovation. And that is such a boon for new products. They're constantly competing. They're constantly innovating. And you don't see that kind of thing. Europe doesn't have one in the top 10 of tech companies globally. And there's a reason for that. I think that the regulatory environment is a large part of that. And what we see from the FTC is a threat to that environment. It's kind of that light touch regulatory model that's worked in so many industries. And tech has benefited from that. That's kind of always how it's been treated. But because things have gotten politicized and because the companies have gotten so big, and the neo-Brandesians, as they're called at FTC, they're kind of back on that populist, big is bad, no matter what big is doing. And we wanted to push back on that and offer some alternative ways to look at things.
Well, and let's get into this. I mean, so, it's interesting because we could talk about the bastardization of the definition of fraud, because that was turned against CEI a number of years ago when it came to climate issues and investigations by agencies and law enforcement entities abusing their power. But let's talk about how this is manifesting itself. I mean, is some of this driven by another policy application of the precautionary principle, right? The idea that you have to prove that you're not doing harm, or is this something else entirely?
Well, I think that's always a part of it, right?
Yeah.
There's this sort of risk aversion that regulators have, especially people in favor of really heavy, strong regulation. Of course, that's not how the free enterprise system works, right? You have to be able to take risks. You just want those risks to be centered in private hands so that those individuals with skin in the game can make those decisions. You don't want taxpayers on the hook and things like that. So there's always a little bit of that mindset at work, I think, which you always have to push back against. Because, if nobody ever took a chance on what I'm sure at the time seemed like a crazy idea, but now is a part of our tech life that we would think, oh my gosh, I can't leave the house without that, right? We wouldn't get anywhere. So that idea that you have to, this mother may I get permission from regulators to buy a company or merge with a company or start a new idea is something that we just think is so bad for the American consumer, and taxpayers shouldn't be funding their own demise in that way. So we're shining a light on that stuff. And part of it is legal cases being brought against things that just, the best example I can give you is that the FTC acted to block the merger of Illumina Grail. So these are two companies, and basically when they were merged together, what they allow for is a multi-cancer early testing kit. And they moved to block that because they said, well, they're the first movers in this market. We don't have that. And if they got in this together, maybe they wouldn't offer their services to other people. So what they're saying is we're going to let people die, quite literally, because we're worried that there isn't enough competition in a market that doesn't even exist yet. And that is sort of like the precautionary principle that you mentioned on steroids. So fortunately, the courts disagreed with them and the merger's gone through. But that sort of gives you an insight into the thinking and their determination to change the rules of how business can operate.
I had a conversation recently with somebody talking about how science should inform public policy and the issue of the concept of the scientific consensus. And this person pointed out, it was Steve Meyer from the Discovery Institute, pointed out that invariably when someone invokes the consensus of science, it's a way of trying to shut down the debate and discussion. And you need that debate and discussion. In fact, with my own regulatory work, the public involvement in that process is vital in terms of informing those things. This is what we're talking about here is sort of you get this is what Dr. Stephen Meyer said, was that ultimately what you get is a small group of elite scientists, again, using air quotes, who are making these decisions. But if their position is skewed, they're going to make the wrong decision. And again, they're going to misrepresent or miscalculate the risks that are involved, aren't they, Jessica?
Yeah. And also, everybody has their lens through which they view the world, right? So if you're a regulator at the FTC, the most important thing to you professionally in the whole world are regulations at the FTC.
Sure.
I get it, right?
Yeah.
But if you're a scientist trying to bring life-saving testing technology to market, it shouldn't be that those regulatory concerns are put above your work too, right? And that's the problem with locating the power for those decisions to go through or not in the wrong hands, right? Because it's not like the FTC isn't well-intentioned. It's just that, perhaps people who would like to know whether or not they have cancer as soon as possible have a better argument to make than people who are very concerned about the regulatory state.
I just did a show with our good friend, former colleague Jerry Rogers about the issue of people making political decisions, sort of putting things in their political lens and making regulatory decisions in that way, or business decisions in that way. I know you guys at CEI and other organizations are working on the ESG issue, which is a way of putting sort of progressive statist economic and political philosophies in terms of investment, and you get skewed results that way. It's funny, you were talking about intentions. I very rarely use this phrase on this show. I use it elsewhere. My father, the environmental scientist, used to tell me, Andrew, there are many roads to utopia. All, however, must traverse the surface of the earth. And he was right. I mean, in the end, you have to. Intentions are all well and good, but we have to deal with the reality. And so when you put, whether it's ESG or DEI or a very outmoded view of risk, and let me add to this, Jessica, the status, we won't make it a left-right, progressive conservative or progressive or libertarian. Let's just say the status, those who want to seek to grow the regulatory state, they seem to be driven by a goal of reducing risk to zero. That can't be done. Talk about that. Talk about what I've just been talking about the political outcomes.
Yeah, and I think that something we repeat here a lot, because it's true, is we're not necessarily happy with every decision or every outcome the market comes up with. The market's doesn't give you the perfect solution every time. The genius of the market, among other things, is that it's the fastest to correct.
Yes.
Right? So if I'm a regulator and I make a bad regulation, it is a prolonged, if not impossible, process to get that removed or altered. But if I'm an entrepreneur in the marketplace and I see something isn't working, or my customers are unhappy, or I think of something better, that's a much faster process. And then, so that leads us to the second advantage, which is not that this is all about making money and ESG is bad because it interferes with making money. It's that through capitalism, that goal of return to investors throws off a bunch of collateral benefits, right?
Yes.
We all benefit from that. And if you start fiddling with that, it's sort of like parallel to the consumer welfare standard in antitrust. If you get rid of having the consumer at the heart of things, then you end up in situations where you throw that consumer under the bus, right? If I'm trying to protect the little artisan bread maker who has to charge $5 a loaf from the big national bread maker who could charge $2, well, what do I have to do to protect the little guy? I have to raise the price of the cheap bread, right? So then who gets hurt? The consumer, right? Both bread companies are going to stay in business, but it's the consumer who ends up paying. And that's why the big revolution in antitrust was keeping the consumer as the goal and the number one priority of antitrust law, in the same way that return to investors should be the goal of capitalism. Because anytime you lose sight of that North Star, you're going to end up injuring that process.
There was a very strange moment during the State of the Union, not a strange moment, it was a calculated moment within the State of the Union in which the president was taking to task oil companies for taking their profits and reinvesting in their buying back their stock. So, you laugh. So talk a little bit about that.
You really can't win for losing anymore, right? Because if you pay out, then you're paying too much out. If you reinvest, then you're just emphasizing your growth and concentration. And by the way, it shouldn't be a punishable offense to be successful. And that's leaving aside all of the ironies about this administration saying anything about the energy industry. They've made it so difficult to get affordable, reliable energy to Americans and people all over the world that it's sort of laughable that they can't just come out and say what they're really after here, which, is obvious to anyone who's paying attention. It's just that you have to, the biggest favor any administration, any party, anyone could do for free enterprise is just get out of its way, right? We know,
as Wayne Cruz says, that you don't have to teach the grass to grow; you just have to get the rocks off the lawn. But
it's the truth,
because
we're so blessed to have figured this out. We live at a time where we figured out what works, and again, not perfectly, but far and away better than anything else. And it's amazing the amount of time and energy we inflict on ourselves by fighting it. There's just not, it's not rocket science to say a light touch regulatory approach, the rule of law, property rights, you know, basically the U.S. Constitution and the free enterprise system are pretty darn good models for how to make a productive, free society.
You know, you talk about ulterior motives, and again, sort of to name drop another CEI employee, the great Myron Ebell. You know, it's one of those that Myron Ebell talks about with regards to climate change, with climate policy. It's not as though, and petroleum policy generally, it's not as though the statists have been trying to do these things in other guises for the last 50 years. Literally, the last 50 years. It's always been the same goal to get rid of internal combustion engines. Listen, let's turn our attention to other areas in tech. Let's get a little controversial here. Well, you know, it's you and me, so we're not going to get too controversial. But you know, talking about the antitrust issues and big tech and the issues of regulation in these social media companies and you know, consumer protection versus the fact that they're private platforms. And you and I have current and former colleagues that are all over the place on this. But let's talk about the debate and where things are coming down in terms of platforms like Twitter or platforms like Facebook or Google. Talk about that.
So I think the first place to start that's really helpful to have a reasonable, illuminating conversation about this stuff is parsing out the antitrust parts from the content moderation, censorship, speech stuff.
Sure.
Those two issues have been all tangled up, sometimes on purpose for political reasons, and sometimes just because it's all the same companies. Yeah. So I think it's pretty easy on the antitrust side to say, listen, you're either for more or less government intervention into business practices. Sure. Antitrust is no big special thing. It's regulation, right? I mean, it is in its best form when it's honoring the consumer, but you're either for more of that or less. And that's a pretty straightforward situation. So if you can pull that stuff out of it, which I think is what we're seeing with the Republican House majority, you're seeing the Republicans kind of set those things aside and not go after breaking these companies up, because we've had a couple years for people like me to say, okay, well, so you want to tell your constituents that you ended Amazon Prime? Like that's what some of this legislation would do.
Okay, but time out for a second. Yeah, I agree with you, right? We're especially talking about the rates and things. I'm interrupting you, Jessica. I'm sorry. Nope. But, you know, like one of the things that gets me, and maybe you can noodle this through for me, is, and again, it's all about me, you know, is okay.
Your show.
I have a Kindle, right? I read on my Kindle. I can no longer buy books directly through the Kindle app because Google's Play Store app doesn't allow for purchases. And again, I know it's their platform, but that, you know, that maybe it doesn't harm me, but it certainly annoys me that I can't do this. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think it harms you, and I think that there's legitimate guff about, you know, I wish this worked better and I wish this was more.
But time out. But I can go to my Amazon, yes, because I do use an Amazon Alexa. I can go to my Amazon Alexa and say, hey, Alexa, buy me Tracy Flick Can't Win on Kindle, the sequel to Election, because that's what I want to read. Anyway, I can buy that on my Alexa. I just can't buy it through Kindle. It's crazy. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, but I think that, you know, your reaction to that as a consumer is part of this system too, where you say to yourself in the future, am I going to sign up for more disappointment over here, or am I going to stay on this platform where there's more flexibility, right? So I think that consumers have a role to play in that. And I always say to people, it's not that I don't personally have frustrations with things, or I don't see other people's frustrations. It's just that I can promise you, for however annoying that is, federal agencies will be more annoying, right? Yes. However bad Kindle is making the experience, it's not the post office, right? So that's, you kind of always have to ask yourself, okay,
an excellent point.
You know, compared to what is a good public policy question to keep in mind, compared to what, how annoying is this compared to what? But I think, you know, if we can say to ourselves, we kind of know where we are probably in terms of how much regulation we like in general, and that probably clears up a lot of the antitrust stuff. Some people are creeped out because these tech companies are big. I will humbly submit to you that the next round of whatever the next big generation of companies will dwarf these. This is how it always goes. And if you're a student of history, that probably is already your instinct. So we can just skip ahead to the real controversy, which is the social media content moderation, censorship stuff, right? That's like the real stuff that makes people crazy. And I would never defend individual decisions that are made on content moderation. But I will say this about it. Not only is it private property and their right to make good or bad decisions, but also it's really hard. Billions of posts a day. And what they're trying to do is make an environment, curate an environment where you want to spend your eyeballs sitting on it, right?
Sure.
And that's hard to know because one person's joke is another person's bullying, is another person's art, is another person's pornography. Like, these are difficult decisions. And I think there have been some bad decisions made, but I think that the explanation for a lot of it is it's hard to make everyone happy all the time. And also, I think a lot of these companies, and this is before Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, were largely run by people who probably lean pretty left.
Yeah.
Because they live on the coast and they're college educated and they're young and all these things that just politically skew that way. And, it's like a fish doesn't know that the water's wet. I don't think they go to work saying, today I'm going to be biased, but I think we're all biased. I know I'm very biased in a way that's particularly strange because I love capitalism. So I know what it is to feel outnumbered. And I understand those frustrations with the individual decisions, but I will just encourage everyone to say it's such early days. These companies haven't been around that long, even though they're such a big part of our life. And you're going to have so many more options and so many more platforms. And to think that half of the country is teed off and that no entrepreneurial spirit exists in America to take advantage of that is crazy, right? This is like a ripe area for someone to come in and offer an alternative. And we're seeing that, for better or worse. It works better, it doesn't. I mean, I think Elon's doing a pretty good job of shaking everything up, right? Not to say that there aren't problems, but there's problems on every platform. I mean, and also he's, by the way, spending his spare time landing rockets backwards and trying to go to the moon. So he's juggling, as we all understand. But I just think that, again, compared to what? That's what I say. These are frustrations. These are problems. Compared to the FTC being in charge of free speech online, Josh Hawley being in charge of free speech online, Senator Elizabeth Warren being in charge.
See, that's where I come back to, right? Because I have deep in a like one of the things that I come back to from an empirical standpoint is, okay, is there an element of fraud that's involved? I mean, keeping in mind, of course, that we as a people do not have a really good understanding of the fact that when these services are free, you are the product. And it's something that a lot of folks don't understand. So once you're allowing yourself to be used as the product, you're giving up a certain degree of your rights, whether or not it's privacy rights or et cetera. But there's the issue of when I am paying for services on Facebook or Twitter, like if I'm paying to promote things on Facebook, which I haven't done in a very long time because I felt that I was never getting my money's worth from it. And so is that somewhere where there could be some kind of an inquiry into this? Not that I want to be, let's say social media company X, you pay a certain amount to have things promoted. You have no way really of knowing how they're being promoted. Again, not that I want to create each individual parochial carp that I have about something, but like I have a Facebook group that, is supposed to be the listeners of one of my shows. And the fact that not all of my subscribers to that page see my content, that seems odd to me. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I think that's legitimate. And I think that here's the span of the scope of that discussion is on one hand, freedom of association, right? They don't have to contract with you. You don't have to contract with them. I still believe in that. I don't want someone to be forced to make a cake they don't want. I don't want to force Chick-fil-A or Hobby Lobby to be open on Sundays. So I'm, in general, for letting people do what they will with their businesses and in contracting with other businesses, but that's different than fraud, which is being misled, right? So in the fine print, if it says we can choose to do this, show it or not or whatever, and you still make the contract with them, then you've signed it away. Now, if it's misleading, that's different. And part of what we're seeing right now, which is also good news, is that through all the Twitter files and these hearings with the Committee on the Weaponization of Government and stuff, no matter what happens with all that, the benefit is that we're all becoming smarter, more educated consumers and users of these products, right? Because I do this all the time. So I know that these platforms have their terms of use, whatever they paid lawyers to write watertight terms of use, we could all retire 100 times on, right? Like basically the terms of use say we can do whatever we want.
Right.
I could summarize it, right? And we've all implicitly agreed to that. But I don't know that everybody knew that. But now we're seeing, how do these decisions get made? What's really going on? Because moderating content for a tech platform isn't a newsroom, right? When the Hunter Biden laptop story came out, I know a few people in newsrooms here, real journalists, who said, wow, that sounds like a crazy story. We need to make a few phone calls and check that story. And then, 20, 30 minutes later, out they went with the story. That's not something Twitter or Facebook signed up for, right? That's where they are. They're going to have to figure that out. I think that's a mistake and an oversight, but I don't think it's market failure. And I think now, I hope more of us users understand that, just because I see it on Twitter or I don't see it on Twitter, it doesn't mean it's true or it's not true. And I think that that's part of the learning curve with any new technology. I mean, when you talk about all the stuff that there's great old newspaper articles where all these advocacy groups want to ban the bicycle because there's all these articles about how kids are going to stop reading and socializing. They're just going to be riding their bikes around. I mean, it's just crazy. So this is sort of, again, it's human nature. We get a new toy, we play with it. It doesn't work quite right. We get scared of it. We come back, we figure it out. I just want to caution everyone that, involving the federal government with a heavy hand is probably not going to be the way to fix it.
This is that, and I appreciate that point, right? Which is, do you want X, the status quo now, or do you want Elizabeth Warren involved? And I would say I'd rather have the status quo here. It's funny you talk about the issue of the bicycle. I saw a meme just the other day. The theme of it was, so you think that all of a sudden smartphones have made everybody antisocial, and there are all of these pictures of people, buried in their heads buried in newspapers and trains or platforms or whatever.
We like to invent things, and then we like to worry a lot about them. And the great thing about humanity is we figure it out, right? And I, for one, would rather have that process happen in communities, in families, in homes, than have it play out on the federal stage with these sort of top-down dictums about how things are going to go. I just don't think that allows for innovation and correction, right? Because when you regulate for a problem, you're sort of preventing how the market would respond to that problem.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
That's how we don't, that's the short circuit we worry about here at CEI. We don't want that. We're not saying, gosh, it's going great out there in social media. There are problems. No doubt. But let's see what the market response will be, because all the incentives are in place to make it better and better and better.
One of the questions you raised this, and it was an area I'm glad you did to go into, which is the issue of the terms of service that you click on. And listen, I'm like everybody else. I just go and I go click. No, I want to click on. So you click on it, but you don't read it. And then, you're waving away all of these rights. I'm not talking about litigation, but let's talk about privacy, right? Which is, I know, as a small L libertarian, a conservatarian, whatever, the issue of privacy, especially online privacy, and it gets into Google. And again, getting back to this adage that if something on the internet is free, it means that you're the product. How do we balance these lengthy, watertight contracts that we should read but we don't, with the issues of the right to privacy? And again, what's the role of the marketplace? What's the role of government, if there is one? Talk about that.
Yeah, so privacy is a tricky one, because it can mean so many things. And oftentimes when you have conversations about privacy, you realize halfway through the conversation, oh, you're talking about security, right? Because sometimes that's what it can mean too. Not that you just want to make sure it's okay if the bank has your information, but you want to make sure they're keeping it secure so no one else has it.
No, I mean, right? I'm talking about my my conversations with people and somebody at internet service provider, internet product provider X, looking through it and aggregating that information. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that information does sort of want to be free and moving, and you need some of that in society. Some non-identifiable information about you is probably really helpful to have out there floating around, like with targeted ads. You're probably seeing ads for things you might actually be interested in. We're probably okay with that. But
so wait a minute. Hold on. Wait a minute, Jessica. So they're not reading my minds when I'm thinking about something?
I mean, if the algorithm's good enough, they're working on that. That's more of an AI conversation.
Oh, yes.
But, with targeted ads and things like that, I mean, and I hear people in congressional hearings lose their minds about, they put, you can find my home address on the internet. And I think, I don't know how much older I am than you, but there used to be this thing called the phone book. And if you didn't want your phone number and your home address and the proper spelling, your middle initial, you had to proactively take that out. So some things are a matter of public record. And that's
Hold on. I remember our good friends at Reason, one of their issues of Reason magazine, if you were a subscriber, you had an actual subscription to your home, the front cover of that month's Reason was a satellite picture of your home.
So
and they had a generic one if you weren't a subscriber, but it was a crazy go nuts thing. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, but that's, I mean, the thing is, it crosses a line from, publicly available information that's helpful and useful commercially into creepy or dangerous, right? So your financial information, your medical information, that's all very different than, where do I like to shop? And could somebody give me a coupon for it? I'm pretty happy to give that away, right? I'm pretty happy to be the product at the groceries. And that's the other thing. This is not just online. If you use a club card, if you use any of that gas stations, grocery stores, that's all being aggregated. And that's just consumer information. It's not personalized, and that's different. But sensitive material is something different. And there right now is a big push to pass federal legislation that is tricky, and it has to be done right because it can't treat can't treat your banking information like your shopping information, like your cancer screening. Like these are different things. So it's a big job for Congress to get right. But of course, Congress being Congress, it's not getting done because while states go on and pass all these patchworks of legislation, which is a mess, they're fighting about should there be a private right of action, and are we going to preempt these state laws? Of course, you should preempt the state laws. You're the federal government. And also, no, we do not need to turn this into a bonanza for the trial bar because, like that's not what we're doing here. That's about getting reelected and doing favors. That's not about solving problems for consumers. So I will just offer that up humbly as an example to you. Of any time you try to get a group of politicians to solve your problems, other priorities are going to sneak into their brains and make it difficult.
Absolutely. Politics gets injected into the process and all. I was going to use an expletive. I will not use. But speaking of which, getting politicians involved to solve a problem, President of the State of the Union was talking about broadband and broadband deployment and the digital divide. He doesn't want kids. Stopping at McDonald's to do their homework. Talk about that.
The infrastructure bill that was already passed allocates $65 billion to broadband. If we cannot get this done with $65 billion, I don't know what to say. I mean, that is just an extraordinary amount of money to give to an industry, by the way, that is very successful and very profitable and does a great job, right? I don't know if anyone's noticed, but your internet's getting faster and faster, and it works in more and more places. And part of the digital divide stuff is rural versus high density areas. And you can see that as a pretty straightforward economic issue, right? If there's a bunch of people living there, these companies can more easily recoup the cost of running fiber there. It's harder in rural areas. I live in a rural area. And at some point, you have to take responsibility for living in a rural area. My neighborhood on my dirt road actually got together and paid someone to lay fiber with the ditch witch down the road because we... and thankfully we did it before COVID. Just a happy coincidence. But the digital divide that the FCC is about to look into right now is about is there discrimination against minority groups, protected classes for broadband adoption, and there's just no evidence for that, right? And Congress also kind of muddied the water in giving away the $65 billion because. They kind of gave you the normal protected class list, color and national origin and gender and blah, blah, blah. And then they added in this new one, which is how much money you make.
Yeah.
Well, the problem with how much money you make as a protected class is that's a reasonable economic factor for these companies to take into consideration.
Sure. Absolutely.
And if you look at the data of the digital divide, a lot of times it's not about access to broadband that's the problem. It's about how motivated are these people to adopt it, right? A lot of people don't want fiber. They don't want to pay for fiber into their house because they can get along with their smartphone. If you don't have a bunch of tablets and a desk computer.
Which, by the way, is kind of what you would want in the end, is you want that. But go ahead. Yes.
So, no, but this is exactly the point. You know, where are we going? What will our devices look like in 10 years? We don't know. I don't know. Yeah. But I know that it's better to let the market adapt and respond to those changing needs rather than spending $65 billion, and some of it, you know, to people who might not even want it if it's there because they're like, I don't know, I got a phone. Right?
I got a phone and I can create a My Spy hotspot and, you know, go from there.
Yeah, because and 5G is rolling along nicely, right? Like our wireless situation is great. So, you know, we have 3 big carriers offering that or about to roll it out in more places. So I just think, again, it's just a light touch here because if you don't want a bunch of bureaucrats trying to predict the future of internet connectivity 5, 10, 15 years down the road, right? This has to be something where you allow the maximum flexibility because we really have no idea, you know, what's next, right? Is it the metaverse and the virtual reality? Is it not that? You can find people to make a good case for either. We don't know what's going to be required. So $65 billion is a lot of money to expect guys in DC to dole out. You know, that's a lot of money that's taken out of the private sector and allocated in a way that the market might not allocate it.
Especially when their track record in terms of predicting what's going to happen in the marketplace is so bad. So
it's not good. And, you know, and there's also really things they could do to help that would be neutral like that. You know, there just needs to be more spectrum that's moved out of sitting fallow in government agencies because they just don't want to let it go just in case one day we'll need it. And move it into private hands for best and highest use. Let's put all that spectrum to work.
I've been down that road where we were trying to get spectrum wrested out of a certain cabinet agency, and the secretary of that cabinet agency did not want to see that spectrum wrested from her. You can figure that out, her agency's purview. So, Jessica, let's shift gears because I say this every episode. I'm going to say it again for those of you just tuning in. I think it's important for our viewers, our listeners, to understand that, you know, that it's not just about tech policy for Jessica. It's not just about public policy generally. She has a life outside of these things, and I think it's important to sort of flesh that out. You're a mom. You got 2 kids. What sort of, not that you have a lot of time for outside interests, but talk a little bit about your outside interests. What do you do when you're not doing this kind of policy work?
Well, my kids and I live a little bit out of town. For people who aren't familiar with DC, you don't have to go too far and it gets into horse country. So we live out there near Middleburg, Virginia, in the plains. And it's beautiful and a wonderful place to raise kids. And, you know, it's a real gift when you can tell your kids whenever they say, I'm bored, to tell them to go out and find a turtle. So I knew I wanted that kind of experience for them. So we have a couple ponies in the front yard. We ride. It's a great community of families out there. And I'm very lucky to have that. I get to spend the perfect amount of time in Washington where you kind of get your fix and you keep your finger on the pulse, but you can retreat and go back into a little bit more of the real world and spend time with friends and family. So I'm very blessed, very lucky to have that balance. And every minute I'm not thinking about tech policy or antitrust policy, I'm usually with my family.
What, and your kids are riding as well?
They are. My daughter, I'll tell you this because it's such a funny story. It's one of the only places in the world, the plains, the Middleburg area, has beagling. So if you know about fox hunting, where we don't, by the way, they're not killing the fox anymore, so nobody come at me.
Well, but once we learned what the fox was saying, we had to stop.
I mean, he is asking for it. No, they're adorable. We feed them, we take care of them. Anyway, the fox hunting is for adults. It's a very dangerous sport. And many years ago, moms in that community said, well, we want something for our kids to do, but we don't want them to break their necks. So they do this thing, which is beagling. So it's ponies, not horses. It's beagles, not hounds. And they chase bunnies that we never catch. instead of foxes. And it's basically just an excuse to spend the day with your
Nice.
family riding around the countryside. And it's a great pleasure.
When did you start riding?
Since I was young, since I was
Okay.
little. I did it even in Southern California, which you probably can't even do anymore. But it was a different Orange County when we still had the avocado fields and the orange groves then.
Oh, yes.
But now I'm in horse country, so I feel like I'm with my people.
My older daughter loves to ride. The rest of us have gotten in. We do it basically once every vacation. We go out on horseback
To
and
appease
we'll
her.
certainly get
Yeah,
into it this summer.
it's a disease of addiction, riding. So we must be appeased. So that's nice of you guys to do that.
We want to do. We've been wanting to do for some time some kind of multi-day backcountry mountain horseback riding trip.
Do it.
That's what.
Or go
we're
to
talking
England or Ireland where they do those treks.
Oh, listen, we would love to do that. So, Jessica, how do folks find out more about the work that you are up to and the work that CEI is doing?
Please come visit us online at cei.org, and you'll find our Eye on the FTC site also on that website, and lots of other great stuff and lots of other regulatory areas that impact consumers every day. It's a great group of people, and I can tell you they are sincere, kind, funny, smart folks that really give it their all. So come see us, cei.org.
So for those of you who don't know, the Competitive Enterprise Institute also does an annual dinner. It is the only dinner that I truly look forward to when I'm invited. That I truly look forward to. Do you guys have a dinner theme this year yet? Has that been picked out?
We do, but we're not allowed to say.
announce
But
it.
I will just tell you, last year's it was the 1970s are back.
There
and
you
it
go.
was a disco bonanza, and we had a lot of fun with it. And I promise you, this year's will be even more fun. We do pride ourselves on having the most fun dinner.
Yes.
In DC, everybody works hard in this town, so we've got to have a night to just enjoy each other and remember to be just a little bit more full of joy and merriment than this
Jessica,
town usually allows.
Of course, yeah. You have to have fun. Jessica, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure always to talk to you, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Our guest has been Jessica Melugin. She is the director of the Center for Technology and Innovation at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm Andrew Langer. I'm your host. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream